Yeah, my name's Adam Foringer. I'm DNR forester here in Buffalo. There in Buffalo County, I do pretty much all DNR forestry in Buffalo County, and then in Trimpolo, I assist Mark with the public lands base. He has a lot of wildlife areas and some fisheries areas. So when we're going to do any commercial management, pre-harvest invasive species control, things like that, that's where I'm involved. So that's a little bit about where I come into play here. I can talk to you a little bit about what we've got going on here. I kind of start with some of the history on this property. I was talking to Kirk yesterday. Basically, this was maybe the landowner prior to who he got this from as a beef farm. The woods was grazed. They ran cattle in the woods. I speculate, you can tell better from back here down by the barn where we met this morning, is really steep at certain places. So I speculate this was not row crop. This was probably a pasture. It was something open because they grid planted pine on it. So it was some kind of an open cover type. You know, we got some of these old holdover oaks here, but so that's a little bit about, you know, some of the backstory. We cut a slab off of this stump yesterday, cut a cookie off of this stump. This stump was cut out on the thinning last fall, 2020. I rough counted 49 rings on that, which seems to jive with what we saw, what we heard from Kirk. So we're looking at about a 15-year-old plantation here. When Kirk first bought this property, so we're talking about 25 years ago, he came in here and girdled, he said, about 20 oak trees. This is where land, and try to not move around too much for you. This is where you know, the landowner objectives might come into play. The idea that Kirk had there was to girdle the oak trees to release the pine, right? So maybe you're thinking, oh, I wouldn't do that. I'd rather have oak trees and the acorns and maybe even future lumber quality from that. But again, you know, this is a pine plantation. I guess the determination was made, we're going to keep this kind of in its contiguous format and its rows where we can manage it commercially. When you have a land base like this, and you can do different things in different areas. He has a lot of native hardwoods and a lot of oak. You know, he made the determination we're going to grow pine here. It's only a 5-acre planting. So the other benefit to that is what you're doing, you can even see the old 20-year-old chainsaw marks on those girdled oaks still. What you're doing by that is creating what I call raptor snags, wildlife snags. Birds of prey in particular like trees without leaves in them because they can see a lot better. So they can kind of see all those rodents. We do clear cuts to regenerate forests. We like to leave those. Mark will love to see those raptor snags on his timber sales on his property because you get that wildlife benefit from it. Then there are eventually cavity trees or the holes, you know, and then you got wildlife living in there. So there is some benefit to girdling and leaving dead standing trees in your forest, especially if you have non-desirable species like box elder, things like that. You can girdle them. You're getting that species out of the equation with the crown competition. You're getting that seed source out of the equation. And you're turning it into a raptor snag. So you can kind of get multiple benefits with doing things like that. I believe, and you can weigh in on this too, Kevin, if you recall, but I believe this was thinned once in the past prior to the last entry. Okay, so I'm not going to know too much about that, but we're going to focus on what happened here, this last thinning, or at least thinning attempt. The initial approach was to bring in a hand cutting crew. When I say hand cutting, I'm referring to, there are some of these pamphlets. There's one of them left, maybe. Well, it looks like everybody's got some. I can give this one out too, but basically what I'm talking about hand cutting is a guy with a chainsaw out here cutting, or a couple guys with chainsaws out here cutting the trees down, and then we have a cable skidder, which is you know, kind of a smaller, more maneuverable skidder, has a 100 or 200 feet of cable on the back, 4 or 5 chokers. So basically you're going to have a guy out in the woods dropping and topping trees, and then you're going to have the cable skidder come up, get out, spool out the cable, hook up the chokers, winch all the logs together. That is how you log on steep terrain. That's how you do it here. You guys see those skyline systems that they've got set up on the Axeman shows and whatnot. I've seen that once east of the Mississippi, and that was West Virginia. That just doesn't, don't really do that in this neck of the woods. If we're cutting on steep terrain, that's probably what it's going to be. We can move around on that. You know, the skidder, I said, is smaller. They can get up on these tighter slopes. The hand cutter's ability basically comes down to his comfort level and physicality, you know, on what kind of terrain they're gonna work on. So that's how you can really work on slopes. Problem is, and it's laborious. Cost of production's high there. Production itself is pretty low. So you got a guy out there with a chainsaw trying to get all this done. Pine isn't a terribly valuable species, especially when you're trying to deal with pulpwood out of the tops, you know, and get some of that volume. For them to hand cut and cable skid that out with the time that it takes, and then the actual volume, the actual money you get for that value when they get it to the mill, just a lot of times cannot be penciled out. I think that's part of what came into play here. The hand cutting did not work. They discontinued that shortly after starting it. So then what happened is we brought in a cut to length crew. I say we, Kirk and maybe the forester he was working with. And that's what you're seeing here, where this pine got thin was a cut to length crew. This processor, I would say this is probably the most common logging approach in Wisconsin, you know, with our paper industry and whatnot. Basically what you got here is you got a processor, you know, a cutting machine in the wood that's cutting the tree at the stump. It's cutting it and it's bucking them up into 8 foot, 10 foot, 12 foot logs at the stump, whatever those markets are. Then you got the forwarder, you know, coming by with the bunks that's going to load them up, take it to the landing. Pretty efficient, you know. And I make the analogy a lot of times with pulpwood, with, you know, lower product classes. You might not be getting a whole lot of money, but it's like a baker selling donuts for 50 cents a piece. You make a lot of money if you sell a lot of donuts. You know, it really comes down to economy of scale with things like these lower value product classes like pulpwood. So to being able to really move that volume out there with this equipment is how they can make that pencil out. So that's what we're, you know, talking for a lot of the cases for pine management, for moving a high volume of pulpwood. Problem is they cannot operate great on steep slopes. These crews are bigger. You got 2 big pieces of equipment in the woods versus 1 smaller skidder. You're going to have issues when that site gets wet. If you get rain, soil moisture, if you're getting a little bit of snow or a lot of snow in there, you're slipping and sliding, you're going to be causing potential erosion concerns, which they can reclaim after a log job, but that might be exacerbated. And you might cause significant damage to your residual timber, meaning the trees that you're trying to keep and maintain and grow to those higher product classes to be more valuable. You don't want those to all get scuffed up because they're in there trying as hard as they can, but still turning, bumping things, and that gravity's working against them. And that came into play here. What basically we see is we got the red pine kind of thin. They blocked this lower elevation, opened it up nice. We got some good crown release. We'll talk a little bit about that with the wood cookie and tree rings. But you can kind of see from here, and if you're back down by the barn later, look out the back. You can see how steep up it goes. You know, they determined that it wasn't going to be feasible for them to work on that slope. So they kind of cut these lower portions and decided to discontinue the job. We've had questions today about white pine markets. It's like, well, does that come into play because it's maybe not as valuable? They weren't plugged into those markets. You know, maybe there could be multiple factors here, but at least the rationale given it makes sense. You know, is trying to get up there and operate on that with a mechanized crew, with a cut to length crew, for the reasons that we were outlining. So, you know, I think they were conscientious and basically saw the painting on the wall and said this isn't gonna be a good thing. Now, cool things, discussions we were having yesterday. This was kind of new to me. I just never really paid enough attention to this. Well, let me not get the cart ahead of the horse. So let me back up a bit. So this was thinned. So then the question comes into, well, why are we thinning it? And this is a plantation, so we're going to focus on plantation thinnings. What it comes down to is, so planting plans. So my planting plans will be about 778 trees per acre. And when we reach that final cut of a mature red pine plantation, I'm thinking 100, 150 trees per acre. So there'll be some natural mortality along that way, but the idea is a lot of that volume is being extracted through thinnings throughout the course of that plantation. And in reality, the site cannot handle 778 trees per acre for 75 years. There's not going to be enough space for that. It's fine when they're little seedlings, but they're going to need more room to grow. If you were passing around this wood cookie, was you guys passing around? Was that the last one?
Yeah, I did.
No, we did. It's all starting to run together here. You can see those 1/4 inch or so rings when it got started, full sunlight, doing great, and then it just starts to get, you know, tight. I think you can see where it pops again here. So that's kind of a cool thing. You can go to Home Depot or look at, you know, your lumber, and you can see where the growth things kind of get tight, and all of a sudden they'll pop open again. That's oftentimes where a thinning happened. They got more crown space, and boom, they started growing again. So you can kind of see like various thinnings throughout the way. So this one was from this stump right here, and then you can just see near the end, you know, I mean, we were getting like sub-millimeter growth. It was just hanging on. And you look at where this tree was, it was kind of punched up under this oak and the three competing pines around it even. So he's just, you might have been flagged out a little bit into the light here, but he was not really in a great spot. And you can just see how much he was struggling to just get a little bit of annual growth and stay alive, but definitely not trucking like this.
About 20 years on 18, I think I counted 18 rings to when it cut narrow.
In an inch, 18 an inch?
No, 18 from about here out to here. It's like 18, and then another, 30 going the rest of the way.
Right. So if he was saying he counted 18 to here and then 30 for this.
Yeah.
right? So that kind of drives the point home. That's pretty good. Now, it's come up before today about wood quality and ring spacing. You know, in theory, when you got really tight rings like this, you're getting better wood quality, right? Now, this is not uncommon for like southern pine, where we're rotating. We're growing red pine 75 years. They're doing loblolly in 25 years, 25 to 30. So they're you know, and the rings are really, you know, as you would suspect, they're going to be pretty far apart. That doesn't make great lumber. You'll see it Menards or Home Depot. They're kind of twisty and bowy, and maybe don't have that I wouldn't say they don't have the structure, but they don't have some of those same qualities. Unfortunately, there really isn't a premium paid for tighter grain, you know, especially down south, or even, you know, wanting volume. And then there's also a stand health component to that. Like, cool, we got tight rings here, but this tree was in bad shape. You don't want to over stagnate, which we'll talk about a little bit. We don't want to grow these things too tight, because then we're going to have tree health issues. We're going to have pest disease outbreaks. So, you know, it might be better. Growth rings like this indicates a vigorous, healthy tree. You know, it's trucking along, it's more able to ward off pest disease, it's got pitch, sap flow. If beetles try to come in, it can push them back out. So by keeping them, you know, it's a trade-off there, right? But you're not really, as a landowner, getting any premium for rings per inch. So you're better to keep these trees healthy and trucking right along. So that is a good example of why we thin. You know, we get those kind of trees out of the equation, the ones that are poor performers, the ones that are suppressed, competing. We try to select our better individuals to retain. We try to space the crowns out a bit.
So how do we thin our forest if there's no market for the product?
Good question. So, good segue too for my next discussion here. I'm going to kind of work towards your answer. There's a couple different phenomenons with plantation management. This is what I was getting at earlier, what we talked about yesterday. It's kind of cool. You know, what we're doing is on the same day, we're putting a bunch of trees in the ground at the same spacing, the same species, and they're all just going to grow and compete with each other. So, for reasons we talked about, I think it needs to happen, you know, especially in red pine, because what happens is, and you can bear witness to this if you observe different red pine plantations that are maybe a little overstocked, you really see pretty homogeneous, you know, diameter. Like, it all looks about the same. Like, you know, the trees are kind of the same diameter, their crowns are kind of the same, they're spaced and they're competing with each other. Versus a white pine, and you can see this even standing right here, so that's what we have up slope. Same phenomenon, same day, everything's gridded out, but they tend to pick their winners and losers better. You know, one tree will kind of become more dominant and create a bigger crown, which is why we're seeing 15, 16-inch diameter trees versus those that are just kind of lose the battle. So you got 8 or 6-inch diameter trees up there, whereas your red pine, the diameters will tend to be much more, you know, uniform. So maybe you can get by with white pine on pushing that thinning back a ways, waiting for market conditions to change, or just buying some time until you figure out what you're going to do. But if you got a red pine stand where you're really starting to get past that window where that thinning needs to happen, and you're starting to worry about stagnation, because what can happen is it gets so tight and dense, and then it gets basically stagnates. And it gets to the point where you can't really thin it. You're not going to get a response. Those trees are just, you got little bitty crowns, they're just too tight. And you basically get to the point where you have to just liquidate it and replant it if you want to keep, you know, moving some of these processes along in the release treatments. So before you get to that point, if absolutely necessary, if it's on a steep land, if it's a smaller plantation that you just can't get interest in, would be to do it non-commercially. Just cut the trees down. If a stand has never been thinned before, if it's a plantation like this, typical first entry is a row thinning, where we'll go and take out every third row. This is what loggers will do on a first entry conifer
Even
thinning.
a good sized tree that 10 inches, and then next to it is one that's 4 inches, planted the same day.
Is that white pine by chance?
Could be some of that, red pine mostly, I guess.
Okay. Yeah, so, you know, like we were saying, white pine is more common to doing that, but basically what can happen over the course of these plantations is, you know, the leader can get broken off from a deer, from a sweaty forester walking by, from tip weevils, things like that. You know, can lose that, what we call dominance, that apical dominance, and then more likely for its neighbors to compete with it. You know, a lot of different things can happen that gives one tree an edge over one of its neighbors, even genetics, you know, perhaps,
yeah,
to where it'll be the one to compete. And then once you get, you know, once you get your dominant trees, like that 16-inch white pine, and there's an 8-inch one behind it, I mean, he's never gonna like catch up and outcompete them. You know, that ship has sailed. So those winners and losers, that natural selection of an artificial plantation kind of happen over time, of those first few decades before anything even happens. So if you do have to do it non-commercially, you have more selective, you can go and kind of pick what you want to cut and not cut. if you have a hope of ever doing commercial management in there, I would still recommend a row thinning the first time. First of all, it's easier because you're going to get pretty tight and you'll have felling lanes. Second of all, you created access lanes for the next entry, so then logging equipment can get in through those access lanes and get out some of that volume for the next time. So even though you can get a little more creative when you do it non-commercially, selecting individual trees, there's still an argument for every third row gets taken out the first time, period, on conifers. So
Yes, well, if we do it by the row, I would hate to see a 10-inch tree cut down.
so how much acreage do you have?
25 maybe.
25 acres of conifer. And what county are you in?
Trimble.
Trimble. So, the first thing I would tie in with Ben from Station 4 or myself, we work together pretty close, and look at getting some lost loggers lists for you, consulting foresters, buyers, because I think there might, with 25 acres of pine in Trimble, I'd like to think we could find a logger for that.
I've had loggers in there, and they wouldn't take it if they got it for free. There's no market for it.
Is it
Worthless.
hilly? Is it hilly?
Yeah, it's hilly.
Right.
Part of the reason is because of its grade, steep.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and so this is where some of those balancing acts come in. I mean, it is a shame to get that merchantable product just dropped on the forest floor and not merchandised, but something will need to be done so we can prevent that stagnation. Where we can continue the rest of that stand to grow and reach maturity. You could still potentially have future harvests, even if it's steep, because you're going to have higher product classes and better volume for that future entry.
Okay, but then you cut one out of the 3 rows. You're going to have 2 rows yet that are still close together.
Yes, but that gives us a release. So those 2 rows that are retained basically have that open row on either side of them to start filling in their crowns. So basically, our standard approach with plantation management is we get them in the ground, we grow them for 30 years, we do that row thinning, and then we thin every 10 years after that. And they got those travel lanes, and after that they come in. That's where you're going to have ideally a forester come in and mark the trees to cut. So that's where the pipsqueaks and stuff get kind of pulled out. You're selecting your better ones, not the small ones that have been overtopped or almost dead already, trying to capitalize off of that value. But in order to get to that point, that non-commercial approach might be needed. Now, if it's any consolation, putting that trees and just leaving them on the ground, I mean, there are wildlife benefits to that. You kind of brush up the understory, for wildlife habitat. It is ultimately it's future soil formation. That's everything that's organic material is going to rot down and become part of that soil. There's amphibians like frogs and salamanders like to actually burrow under dead wood, bigger logs that are on the ground. After timber sale, it benefits for erosion and sedimentation control. When you got slashed on these areas that may have been scuffed up from bare soil or from skid trails that get slashed in. So there are a lot of benefits to having some of that just stuff on the ground. A lot of what we're doing with timber sales is emulating a natural disturbance. So a lot of these factors and processes that occur after a windstorm or a fire or a flood that regenerate stands is a lot of what we try to apply, with forest management techniques. And having a messy site after a timber sale, can look bad, but there are some benefits to keep in mind of that. And I know there's the value there, in the potential revenue stream that's not being realized, but again, it's also an investment in the future. So we're getting these trees that remain to those higher product classes with more potential for
So when I've had thinning done, they don't do every 3rd row. They just go up and down the hill and select.
Good point. So what little bit of plantations we do see in this area, when we do get mechanized crews working on them, that is not an uncommon approach, and it's because of those terrain constraints. Generally, we're going to plant along the contour,
Yes.
like they do with farm fields. You don't want to create those erosion channels, so they're going to almost always plant it along the contour. Then if you're going to get logging equipment in there, you can't really cut those rows along the contour because again, they're sliding, they're causing problems. So they'll just come straight up or straight down and kind of create their own row thinning of sorts. When you're getting that light, you're getting some of those same benefits, but you don't have a nice row to follow. You're kind of trying to pick a path and blast out a swath, maybe a couple rows sort of against the grain.
So when these loggers go in there, and do they select the larger of the trees or the smaller or whatever is around them?
That depends on how much leeway you give them. You want to have a good contract that kind of states what the expectations are, or paint on the trees, or a forester that you're working with to really.
I found the contract don't mean anything.
Well, you
There's
can
need
also
a
request a
forester.
performance bond. You can
Pardon?
ask.
You need a forester to come in and
Well,
walk the
I would
property.
recommend a
even with
forester,
a
absolutely.
forester, they're supposed to go over out the landing, how many trees you have, and and be there when they are loaded and nothing.
There's multiple ways to approach that. They could do a cruise ahead of time, a volume cruise, or a lump sum sale where the prices are agreed on ahead of time. So there's a few different ways to approach that. But
And then I had a trucker take a load, and when he got to the mill with it, it got to be a different farmer where the credit was made to. So the logger, the hauler, didn't get the seller's name correct. So I lost the whole
okay,
shipment of logs to the farmer up here by Pleasantville.
right. Yeah, and so to your point, having a consulting forester is a great
Well, I did
agent to
have
have.
I did have that. He was a consulting forester, but he must have had lots of profit off of his deal because he offered to restore the trails, and he had a bulldozer in there for 2 days, and they don't work for nothing.
No.
And I have my own bulldozer. I wouldn't have needed him, but he must have had a lot of profit in that, and I got pittance.
Some people use a trail camera too to count trucks going out.
We did that.
Yeah.
Very
That's
interesting
what I
to
would
see
do.
what's going on when you're not on the property.
Yeah.
Keep
I
them
royally
honest.
got screwed is what I did, and I'm really fed up with the forest.
I had a neighbor that had a lot of logging done a couple, 3 years ago, and he could not, it was just the opposite of what you're experiencing. He was more complimentary about this
Yeah,
guy.
we were
Well,
happy
you
with
had the
ours.
right. He had the right crew then
Yeah.
doing the work.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was
There's so many
very
crooks
much-
out there. It's scary.
There's lots of different kind of loggers out there. The first guy that I hired made a mess out of my woods.
Yep.
And then the next time I was a little more careful on who I picked.
Loggers are kind of like used car salesmen, you know. As soon as
Well,
you go down the road.
how do you determine who's
Well,
legitimate?
if they take the tops and lay them in front of them and then drive over the tops, they're not making
But how
the
do you
ruts
pick them
and-
is what he's saying.
Oh.
How do you decide? We work with our
References
foresters
and-
for all kinds of
Yeah,
stuff.
you talk to us,
different
talk to
groups.
landowners in the
Yeah.
area that have done logging. You have now insight you can provide to some of your neighbors when they're looking at who to go with.
Yeah.
Definitely share the wealth. These types of discussions. One thing to think about if you are concerned, depending on how much leverage you have as a landowner, is asking for a performance bond. So, if you got some nice timber and a logger's really interested, or loggers are really interested, say, all right, well, we're going to need a $3,000 performance bond that we're going to hold until you've satisfactorily completed this, reclaimed our roads. This is what we do for DNR sales. You got a little more leverage maybe with the land base we manage, but if that's an option, you can ask for a performance bond, and then you've got that money. So if things do go south and you have to hire somebody to come fix up the roads or finish up what they haven't, you've got some funds to do that with. So performance bonds would be one option. And again, this is where a consulting can really kind of help move things through the process. A consulting forester, I don't know if maybe
These
I'll
are
start to
go-to
repeat stuff here.
guys
It's running together,
for
but
everything.
they might
Yeah.
take a 7 to 10% commission, for their services off the timber value revenue. But in theory, they could be getting you a lot more than 7 to 10% off of what a logger or mill might be offering, because they can get out there. First of all, they're incentivized to because they want to increase the commission, right? But they can really get a better volume estimates for the timber, maybe really pair that off current market values and kind of pencil out in theory, a higher price point that they could shop to competing, competitive bid process.
There's nobody to blame for this, but I think I was misguided 30 years ago when we were supposed to plant.
Boy, another thing that really made a difference is the first time I did logging, they dropped trees right on the trails and whatever, and then they bulldozed the trees off and made a big mess for me. Now you're trying to cut up these tops with sand all over them. And
Yeah.
The second time, I put it in the agreement that I don't want no treetops on these trails. Lay it, away from the trail, and that worked out great. Then I had decent firewood to cut up and easy to get through to
You're
cut it
talking
up.
hardwoods.
All oak, yeah.
Yeah.
I got all pretty much veneer
Well,
oak.
there's a market for that. But like I said, 30 years ago they were promoting planting pulpwood. Big deal. It's good profits in it. Now it ain't worth a damn.
Yeah.
Well, now that Versal's shut down,
Yeah, then we got
That made
those
Oak pulp
factors.
isn't worth
you
shit
can't
either.
even
so
sell
be-
your timber.
Excuse me. But be careful what you wish for.
Start looking 10 or 20 years out, boy.
Yeah.
You
How
look
about-
back 10 or 20 years and think how the world's changed since then, boy. That's
Yeah.
a real crapshoot to look out
And then
for.
25 years ago, I was told if you have an acre of walnut, it'd be worth $1 million in 50 years.
Yeah.
Is that
Probably.
maybe still true?
Probably true.
Yeah, we got a
Yeah.
black walnut that we slabbed out. That was from my brother's land.
Yeah.
And those slabs are 3-inch thick slabs with the rough edge.
Make a bar top.
You
out
can
of
get a fortune for those. You can get $50 a foot. I mean, you can finish them. You don't plane them. You can leave them rough cut. They go
Just sell the
really
slabs.
fast.
But who's to say what they're worth 25 or 30 years from now?
Yeah, right.
Well,
Right, by the time you have mature trees again.
if you look online, a 10-foot slab that's maybe this wide, they're getting a couple $1,000s for that piece of wood just to make a table out
So
of.
you're saying that's more profitable than marijuana?
Yeah,
Probably.
Might take you a bit longer though.
Still get annual harvest out of walnuts.
Yeah, no kidding.
So, and we're getting into a whole other realm. You know, we're talking pine and pulpwood. Now we're talking the complete other end of the spectrum, like the most valuable timber that we grow in Wisconsin.
Yeah.
And that's where form and quality really comes into play. You know, managing walnut plantations by like pruning up the butt logs as they start to, you know, shade out those lower branches, getting that clean veneer
Yeah.
wood growing on there where you can really get these price points that, I mean, it's huge for international trade. You know, China buys like a ton of our walnut, and among other countries, so a lot of that gets exported. That can be very
So
valuable.
this white pine and red pine, will that ever be suitable for building material?
Interesting question. So Dan Peterson, one of our other tour guides, was talking about how white pine just lacks the structural properties for any type of building, like structural material. I don't know. I usually think of houses as a southern yellow pine for most framing material. You know much about structural components or red and white?
White pine is it fractures very easily, so it doesn't have the tensile strength like red pine does.
Well, it'd be okay for studding, wouldn't it?
It'd be okay for studding, but you need to make things a little bit higher, bigger. So a full-size 2x4 rather than a store-bought size 2x4, or a 2x6 or 2x8, rather than you can get by with a smaller piece, even if it's balsam, because it fractures easy, and especially because of all the big knots on the white pine that we have nowadays to make things out of. It's usually just used for shelves and decorative. We're not building houses out of it. But World War II, everything was built out of white pine.
Yeah.
And before
Well,
that.
I was in Madison County, Iowa, and down there, 100 years ago, they built farm buildings out of walnut.
Wow.
Now
Yikes.
they're
Different world.
They're dismantling them buildings and getting a fortune for them.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, right.
Yep,
But they
reclaiming
could
that
come,
wood. Yep.
that's just like the oak forest up here. They just came in and took everything and built whatever was handy.
Whatever was
Yeah.
handy, that's right.
I
Yeah.
worked power lines most of my life, and you know, you don't see white pine power poles.
No.
It's all southern yellow or
Yeah.
red.
Red pine does.
Cedar is one of the better ones. You know,
Western
they can
cedar,
withstand the
probably.
storms better and stuff.
And the thing with white pine is that it has that pitch, high pitch content.
Yeah.
First and foremost, mills don't want to deal with it because it
Yeah.
makes a mess in their
Yeah,
sawmill.
Yeah.
And you can't infuse it with any treatment. Red pine will just suck that right up, whereas white pine won't. But it's also the brittleness of the wood as well.
Yeah, right.
all
Or
things-
cedar can take a beating.
Yep, that's right.
What about the red pine absorbent qualities, like for making treated wood?
Oh, yeah.
Isn't that exclusively what they're using now, the red pine?
I think that you can treat red pine easier, period, right?
You
Versus
can't treat white pine at all.
Right. Okay.
Okay, you can't get white pine to soak up that treatment. So red pine is most often used, and I'm from farther north, but all of our red pine bolt size material goes to a mill in Beaver, and they make decking out of it.
Oh.
Okay, so outside application, but they cut it, they treat it, and then it's used for decking.
So what would be the advantage then in going through and thinning a red pine if there's going to be no market for it in 25, 50 years?
I mean, we don't know that for sure. You know, there's discussions. Cooperatives trying to bring Verso back online. Wood cooperatives, you know, like companies kind of banding forces, I think, and maybe bringing that back online. But we don't know entirely what future markets will hold. But just from a forest health standpoint, you know, we'd still want to avoid just losing the plantation to stagnation. You know, where it just gets so tight, and you basically it's going to die on its own, or you've really lost that window of doing management to commercially thin it and continue it growing. So, you know, we may or may not be able to have better markets for those products 20, 25 years later, but I'd still say you're in good shape keeping that stand at those right stocking levels, keeping that stand healthy and growing, you know,
Will it
for
ever
some of
be
the other.
usable for biomass?
What about biomass?
Is red pine a suitable biomass product for burning, for creating heat?
To chip it up?
Chips?
Yeah, and that's another market, you know, and biofuels, you know, using wood chips to fire power plants. Maybe that's something that we see become more prominent, you know, with the prevailing, you know, course of energy and how that might look in the future. maybe those markets will get more robust. That's kind of gone up and down the last few years. Every time natural gas goes down in price,
It was a big promise, and then it went away.
yeah,
Yeah.
whenever natural gas drops, biomass kind of like drops off the radar, you know, and then fossil fuels go up and people are like, oh, let's do this, it's cheaper, it's greener, and then costs go down. So that's something that's kind of ebbed and flowed. There's a power plant in the Twin Cities that burns chips, and we do have a logging contractor up in he works up in Pepin County. He doesn't come down to Buffalo much, but he'll do a lot of chip sales to that mill. So yeah, you know, we could have completely different markets in 25 years. You know, maybe things like that dominate the landscape, or different. They're starting to use wood and in the glass, cellulose material in the glass fibers on phones and things like that.
There's so many
and
factors.
mouthwash.
Yeah.
There's so many factors.
Yeah, yeah.
It's kind of like the stock market. I mean, you can't predict it. You can try, and maybe you could be right, but
And that's what this is.
no
I mean,
guarantee.
right. And in many cases,
think
it's
about
an
in
investment.
business. Long-term planning is what, about 5 years?
Yeah.
Now let's think about forestry. What is
long-term with
long-term
that?
planning? What's
Yeah.
the definition of long-term planning in forestry? 50, 100, 150 years?
Yeah, 50 for sure.
Kind of hard to see the crystal ball clearly.
I see
What should we
hunting
plant?
land selling for $10,000 an acre. But if that's all pines, it wouldn't be worth anything then. You see,
Yeah, I mean,
pines is not conducive to real good deer hunting. They like the
Mixed forest.
Mixed.
Mixed
hard
hardwood.
maple
Good to have
hardwood.
variety.
so if you're actually, you know, let's say someday you maybe want to, are looking at selling or have, you know, thoughts. If you went and blasted out a bunch of pine in that plantation for the management purpose, and you bring all that slash into the understory, you're, you know, it's really improving the kind of the bedding and the habitat for deer. You know, I mean, you can actually use some of those forest management techniques to, you know, improve wildlife habitat and other conditions on the property, especially for prospective buyers. You know, I'm in Buffalo County, so deer hunting is a huge thing and a huge component of land sales and substantial price points where timber is not at all being taken into account there. You know, so there could be some of those other values, prospective buyers' values that they might be concerned at all about timber and might still have some
Yeah.
money to throw around. So,
Yeah, antler growth.
so food for thought there.
But what about with invasives? I mean, should we be worried about loggers bringing on invasive seeds and stuff?
Excellent question. So we'll have contract verbiage for our state contracts, and I would recommend this for any private timber sale contract, that the logging crew shows up with clean equipment. We want that, you know, basically power washed any of the mud out of those tires from the last job, so we're not bringing in garlic mustard seed. That seems to just always show up, especially if this isn't addressed. Garlic mustard seed, buckthorn, honeysuckle, any of these things. But particular things like garlic mustards are just so little, you know, they easily get caught up in a wad of dirt somewhere. So requesting clean equipment. So we call this best management practices for invasive species. So similar things that we do for water quality. So best BMPs for invasives would include things like that. Also, let's say you got a garlic mustard patch on your property. You know what's there. You can't treat it ahead of time. Say, okay, you're going to do this last. Cut everything else, and then come do the area where the garlic mustard is. And then you're done. Go ahead and get out. So we're not moving that garlic mustard seed all the way else around the property, because again, it's so light seeded and it can go everywhere. So there are some, and we have some literature on this. We can get you on the website. I'm sure it's on the website.
Why doesn't the MFL program require some of these BMPs?
So that can come into play, and it might be something different in the future. I'd say first of all, it wasn't a big concern initially. You know, invasives weren't as big of an issue when MFL and forest crop law was getting up off the ground. But so, a guy in Buffalo County, Brent, we're working with landowners where harvesting cannot get done. The markets don't bear it out. The volume's not there. The terrain is too steep. Often comes into play. You can kind of work, gets a little gray, but you kind of work with the landowner to maybe offset or postpone or even cancel that mandatory practice, but instead get in there and do some pretty intensive buckthorn control, because the understory is really getting, you know. And now, to get into the weeds a little bit, for your acreage to be in managed forest law, it has to meet a minimum stocking level. If you go into an oak stand, hoping to coppice and clear cut that and hoping for those stumps to come back, but you got a thick buckthorn understory, a good chance you're not going to get success with that. You go and lop off the top of a 20-acre oak stand without doing any of that buckthorn control, where you got 3,000 stems of buckthorn per acre. That stand ends up being out of compliance with forest stocking. It technically can't be in the program anymore. So, you know, there's incentive for landowners to be thinking about that ahead of time, making sure they're maintaining enough wooded, enough regeneration on these harvests, beating back invasives to facilitate that. There's cost share money that's available through the DNR that us, you know, guys like me and Ben administer. There's cost share monies through the federal government, environmental quality incentive program called EQIP. That's even more lucrative with reimbursement rates, kind of a flat rate to incentivize landowners to do pre-post harvest invasives control, tree planting. things along those lines.
Mhm.
So, yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I think that's one of our biggest threats. You know, Kevin's talking about timelines, and I look at a lot of forests and look at the understory, because that's the future forest. You know, we're looking at the forest, we're thinking about volume and mill and products, and then we're looking at what's next. So what are we going to be dealing with here? What's coming up on this site, you know, or are we going to replant it? So those should be the types of thoughts, you know, landowners and foresters are having those discussions in the woods on that.
If I was Mills, I'd be worried because there's a lot of property owners not doing a thing about buckthorn.
You know, and there can even be perceived, I should say perceived, people can get benefits from it. It holds their deer, you know, holds leaves late into the growing season. There's more wildlife cover there. You know, I can go talk to people about buckthorn control and say, what I want you to do is completely wipe out this understory because it's all buckthorn. And then you're going to be able to see through a quarter mile through the understory of the woods, and that's a lot of times not desirable from a deer management standpoint, you know, from what people are looking for. So you kind of got to work with people about the bigger picture, you know, about the, you know, how this can be really just inhibit forest regeneration. You know, you can look at areas that, so again, that's where landowner objectives kind of come into play, and having those discussions. You can get the same benefits from clear cutting an aspen stand and just having 7,000 stems of aspen that are 6 feet tall within 3 months of cutting.
So
And then you got a future forest there too.
Where is there a line of standing people that will come in with a chainsaw and thin out your forest?
Non-commercially,
Yes,
I have a list. I do have a list of people.
you do.
Yeah, and so, you know, we could. You said you're in Trempealeau, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, holler at me or Ben. We can get you contact info. So that would be the other option. Yeah,
They work by the hour or by the stump, or
that would just be the rates or discussions you'd have to have with them. You know, on what that contract would
I'm
look
too
like.
old to be out there now and be cutting.
Right, and that'd be the way to go. A lot of times when we get non-commercial management done, again, you know, if you have friends or family, people that hunt the property with you, say, hey, come on out, we're gonna have a work day. You know,
Yeah.
Hey,
I'll let
that's
you
an
hunt here in the
idea.
fall. You come out and help me out with some of the management,
Get 'em
things
out
like
there.
that.
That's an idea.
There you go. Yeah,
Yeah.
get the free labor out of them when you
They want to
can.
hunt, come and help
Grandkids,
me out for
They
2
all
days.
they
Slave
pretty much
labor.
rent free. They used my land to hunt. Hey,
Yeah.
good idea.
Time for a
Free
change.
lease. Well, there you go.
But none
They're all
of
wearing
these, none of these
chaps and
guys want to
helmets.
spend the whole day with a chainsaw,
We
I'm
need a
sure.
blood fest.
The non-mechanized people seem to like the big logs in my observation. That
In as far as harvesting, timber
Yeah.
harvesting,
they don't seem interested in oak pulp
I assume you're in the driftless area over here somewhere.
in Jackson County.
In Jackson County.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So that's really going to be the more valuable. You know, saw timber, especially grade saw timber, is going to be much more valuable. When we talk management entries and thinnings, you know, we're talking about thinning here in conifer. Let's say we're thinning in a natural oak stand. If we are not working toward regenerating that stand yet, if we're not working toward clear cutting and establishing a young forest, we're in the tending phase. We're tending that stand. And what we want to do in that phase is keep it as good as we can. We want to keep our best trees going to the end with the best quality, the best potential for the maximum value on that final cut. Good genetics to kind of keep that seed source in the site. So what we ideally want to do for these intermediate treatments is what we call an improvement thinning. Where you go out and you get out all the crap, right? The stuff in the understory, the stuff that's suppressed, the non-desirable species, maybe your elm or your basswood, you know, you keep more of your oak. That would be ideal, right? But that's all the lowest value stuff in there, right? You know, again, economy of scale, right? If you got a cut to link crew in there, they can maybe make that work. If you're getting into where it's hand cutting and it's cable skidding, maybe you'll often, I shouldn't say that, but there's a potential to see the opposite of that happening. The trees that are the most valuable, you know, will get removed, and where the trees that aren't that big yet, or just aren't going to be that big, because again, we're talking in here, everything's the same age, right? This is pretty similar in native oak stands. It probably was a substantial disturbance back in the day that replaced that whole stand, which may have been a bunch of chainsaws, and they all kind of grew back together, and then you got those little 8-inch oaks that are the same age, more or less, as those 24-inch oaks next to them. So there's the potential of that happening opposite of the way we want it, just because of the markets, you know, dictate that. There's a term for that called basically high grading or diameter limit cutting, and you know, those are some of the things that we try to avoid. That's why the MFL program exists, is to try to, you know, move away from market-driven harvesting and really use the harvesting as a tool and toolbox for forest management, along with tree planting, invasives control. It's not the objective. It's one of the tools for sustainable forest management. Renewable resource that we can manage in perpetuity if we play our cards right.
I just want to throw 2 cents in here because
Absolutely.
that was awesome presentation. But to answer your question, somebody did some piss poor planning back in the day for your hillside. It's all about planning. With forestry, I spend my whole career planning forestry operations. A 5-acre red pine plantation planted at 600 to 800 trees per acre on a steep slope is a losing proposition. Who's going to cut that for you? And you're planting it with a requirement that it has to get thin.
Yeah, see, the forester designed this for us.
That was not maybe the right thought process. If this was my hillside, I'd still plant red pine on it, but I might plant 200 trees per acre, and then I'd put some ash in between, and maybe some black walnut, and maybe some white oak. So I have some value to work with there in the future, probably beyond my
Well, I think
lifespan,
maybe
but-
25 years ago there were still some people coming with a truck and a horse with the chainsaw.
It's
Yeah, I
the
did
world
mine.
changed, but the important thing is to think planning. Forestry, business planning is 5 years out. Forestry planning is 150 years out. You really got to think about, okay, what is this going to turn into someday? How can I achieve my objectives?
So how much, again, not being able to predict the future, but you know, part of the system was the topography and the challenges it provides, right? I mean, managed forest law was put in before I bought the land. A lot of topography, you know, the loggers are, well, we got a smaller window to maybe even get in there if we want to. The risk, the poor growth trees in general too.
Yep.
It's sandy soil and
Low value
crappy.
Yeah.
You know, why? And it's in there. It's in my mandate. I have to get pretty much every acre on my property logged at some point. Very little wiggle room there. My forester I'm working with, the DNR guys, understanding that. But why even have it in my plan to begin with? Why not just write that steep hillside off, portions of it, at least the top, say, you know, don't worry about it. Let it. Let
So
nature
there's
take
an
its course,
avenue for that potentially.
you know?
You're allowed like
The
20%.
idea is for managed forest law, you know, that they're going to be commercially managed. You know, to be enrolled in the program, in theory, it should be a forest that can be commercially managed. You know, with wood products being pulled. Again, with the overarching idea being sustainable forest management. We're not just trying to feed mills here, but you can have up to 20% of an MFL enrollment be non-productive. So that doesn't include ag land or pasture, but if a wetland, a bluff prairie, stuff that's maybe just too steep, you know, where it's made the determination we're just not going to be able to really ever do commercial management here, you know, that can get moved into that non-productive category potentially. Areas, you know, of potential significance to you as a landowner from, you know, hunting spot or nostalgic areas. Like I don't want to just see this get whacked. You know, some of that can be incorporated into non-productive. So 20%, you know, on a 100-acre enrollment, you could have 20% of that where prairie, wetland areas that are just set aside too steep or for whatever reason, and you could work with.
Yeah. So should that have been written into the plan?
You can
to
still
begin
do
with?
that. You can
Okay.
redesignate that.
Yeah.
What,
Because
you
he
said you're in
said-
Jackson County?
Yeah, Jackson.
So you could work with Chris.
Yeah,
Talk to
he's
him. It's like,
been on
hey,
the property,
and to be honest, if he's not harping on you about it, I wouldn't worry about it. You know, if he understands, like, oh well, it's too steep, we're just not going to worry about it. You don't even have to go through the extra steps of categorizing it as
He's
non.
been fantastic.
Yeah.
Chris
Chris is great.
We like
But
it.
Yeah, I like Chris.
you know, when I first read this plan, and there's no, you know, it was only about 2 years into the plan when I bought this property. I was involved with the setup of it, but had to live with it or choose to get out, pay some tax. You know.
Yeah, right.
So I said, well, let me sit with this for a little while, make a decision, more educated decision after a few years into it. And you know, as I'm reading over the way of the land structure, they actually have it's you know, it's a range of, you know, based on different areas, 12 to 20 acres or 15 to 17 in this, and you know, that kind of thing. If they did the max cut, it would exceed my actual acreage. I mean, their planning cut everything, and a lot of it was clear cut for oak regen and,
Yep.
and things like that. You know, so they didn't take any of that into account initially. It's, hey, it's acreage, cut it. It's got woods, cut it.
Yeah.
In which it's all wooded. You know, we're early on, and you know, hey, leave a couple of these really steep rock outcroppings that have no value. It's scrap oak, black oak, and a lot of it up there, or small timber white oak that's surviving, and it's in the plan. So you read it, I'm like, holy shit, I'm going to lose everything in my woods. I get Chris out. He's like, no, let's calm down. You know?
Yeah.
But,
Yep.
Yeah.
but you know, I have the foresters, like, or the loggers said, oh yeah, we could get up there. And that's 3-4 years ago. I've been struggling to get anybody else, but you know, others, no, I don't. If I have to cut that, I'll go somewhere down the road, you know, where it's flat.
Yeah, I ran into the thing where it's just about opposite
Yeah.
you. We planted white walnut and white pine every other
Yeah.
other row, and the pine almost disappeared. It was kind of wet. I think they died out in the wet we had over the last few years, and so the walnut is going great. The other thing I've got, and that's sort of what it's put here, is I've got 67 acres in managed forest land, which is a third of the property.
You don't have to be thin to 20.
This is flat.
Good planning.
Oh.
I've got literally goat prairie on some of that.
So how
and
are you
that's
gonna-
managed forest land.
How are you going to harvest it?
And it's never been planted. It came that way.
Oh.
I got probably about 20 acres that was planted on a steep hillside of that. And
How big are your walnuts?
oh, they're this big. And
Black walnut?
black walnut. Yeah, they're 25 years old about.
Don't
Yeah.
they?
Yeah.
Don't they compete with other trees too? The roots of a black walnut.
they
Don't
might.
they affect the tree next to it if it's not a walnut?
Yep, exactly. So that's a phenomenon called allelopathy, and it's kind of
Yeah.
like a natural herbicide that they do, and I think other trees like hemlock maybe that basically controls everything but itself. It's kind of a competition control mechanism. So like our wildlife biologists really don't like walnut. You know, we're talking about it's the most valuable timber species. You know,
Yeah.
they really don't like it because they want prairies. They don't want stuff trying to kill all their native prairie species, you know, that they're
Yeah.
trying to work on. A lot of landowners, maybe just again, landowner objectives, right? Landowners, a nice young walnut stand, like I want to get rid of that. I'm like, oh, you know, but they prefer to see some of that type of cover, you know, in their areas. So yeah, allelopathy, and that can. So in these companion plantings that we're talking about, I will see the walnut and spruce planted together, white spruce, and then 20 years or so, the walnut actually grows pretty quick. You know, we're in good walnut country down here, and it starts to kind of crunch in on the spruce and even close crown above them, and the spruce just look like the most ragged. They're just they're in there. They're getting. I'm pretty sure they're experiencing that allelopathy, and I think it comes from the roots, but I think there's some of that chemical, that juglone in the leaves and the nuts and the twigs. I think everything that kind of comes off that tree helps put that onto the site.
See, that's the thing that changed too. See, I had about 2 acres of walnut and white pine. Okay, well the next year, no, we're not going to do it that way. We're going to do oak and spruce because deer don't like spruce.
Yeah.
See, but
Yep.
Just in
Browse,
one
yep.
year, from 96 to 97 or 97 to 98, just in 1 year, the process changed.
Yeah.
And that's like all this managed forest land that I've got. Never been planted. I never plan to harvest anything on that thing. And it's just, I love it because it's wildlife, but I'm getting the tax break for managed forest land. So you just, how do you keep up with this stuff? How do you even say if you're within the rules and all this sort of stuff? And that's just maybe year to year or 5 or 10 years or 25 years.
Does spruce have any value for building construction?
Kevin?
It does, but our spruce is going to be mostly used for those big pallets that they put underneath the power lines to go over mud and stuff because it's light and it's strong. We don't really
Matting,
have the facilities to make structural lumber. If you think about it, there is no structural lumber being created in Wisconsin anywhere, really. Kukal lumber maybe a little bit because the price is up. All of our structural lumber comes from out west. 2x4s, 2x6s, 2x8s. So white spruce.
And
Yes, it
Canada.
can if you have your own portable sawmill. You can make nice stuff out of it. But it's not going to be graded, stamped, for you to build a house with it.